Hello and welcome to Away with the Pharaohs. Very excited to have Anna Garnett with me today. So we'll be exploring the question, are Egyptian artefacts in museums priceless treasures or just pieces of a puzzle? And delighted to invite you back here in the EES as former trustee. Of course, you're on the editorial board of the magazine Egyptian Archaeology with me, and former BA, MA and PhD student of the University of Liverpool. And of course, you are curator of the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology here at University College London, so just across the way. And of course, if you haven't been to the Petrie, which is a little bit of a diamond in the rough, shall I say, it is in the top 5 of the largest collections of Egyptian artefacts in the world, so definitely worth a visit. And in particular, I love the fact you can open all the drawers underneath the display cabinets. So do have a little check to see what's possibly not quite on display, but still available to see. So yeah, brilliant to have you here, Anna. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here at Doughty Muse and to be in this wonderful library space with you on this very cold afternoon.
So we're here to talk all about museums.
Yes.
And I should point out the Egypt Exploration Society is not a museum. So we have a large archive. However, we have very minimal artefacts on site. And that is mostly because they were distributed around the world, a lot of which went to the Petrie Museum. So we'll be talking a bit more about that later. However, for our listeners, I hope you've possibly been to a museum or even a country house or another place that has a collection of Egyptian artefacts. And I thought what would be great, Anna, is if you could talk us through some of the more popular object types, and let's avoid some of that monumental statuary or architecture that we sometimes see and have possibly already discussed in the podcast. Can we focus a little bit more on the smaller objects that people might have questions about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm privileged to work, as Charlotte said, as the curator for the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology. And the Petrie Museum is well known for having lots and lots and lots of small objects, broken objects that aren't necessarily whole or monumental, but tell really important stories. As Charlotte mentioned, if you've been to a museum or a collection with Egyptian objects, it's very likely that you've seen these particular types of objects which are very, very popular in those collections. So starting off with pottery, because why not? I love pottery.
We should also mention that Anna is a ceramicist and has worked on many a site as the ceramics expert, including Amana. So obviously a great topic to start on.
Pottery is the most well-represented type of object in museum collections of any subject, really, in archaeological collections in particular. And pottery is important for lots of different reasons. So in the collections that you've seen, you might see complete pots, you might see broken pieces of pottery. So it's from pottery, of all the object types, that we can learn the most about the people that lived in ancient Egypt and Sudan thousands of years ago. So whether that is what they cooked with, what sort of vessels they might have had in their graves, whether it is types of pottery that were traded across borders. It's all about thinking about the use of these objects and who are the people behind the pots. And importantly, Flinders Petrie developed a method of using pottery for dating, which is a type of seriation called sequence dating. And this actually, in this process, he developed the world's first detailed prehistoric timeline. So we can also use pottery for dating, which makes it very, very important for archaeologists.
Yeah, and that's a great pictorial representation as well that you can have on your very own merchandise through the EES. So do check out our shop online if you do fancy having it on a mug, say.
Excellent. And a notebook, in fact, of Petrie's illustrations of pottery too. So have a look out for those complete pots, those broken pieces of pottery in these collections, and look closely at them. There's often more of a story there than initially meets the eye.
Egyptian pottery is quite interesting when you compare it to other civilizations, I find, especially, say, ancient Rome and ancient Greece. It seems quite simplistic compared to those cultures, right? It's maybe a bit more practical.
Yeah, in a way I would agree. Perhaps because the vast majority of ancient Egyptian pottery was handmade. So either that or made with a more simple sort of turntable rather than a kick wheel, which was only introduced much later. So a lot of pottery that you might see in museums seems kind of utilitarian, very beige. There's an awful lot of beige in pottery collections in museums. But look closer and you might see the fingerprints there of the potter. You might see elements of decoration where, someone, the potter or another artisan has taken the time to decorate that vessel for a particular reason. So again, they're very practical objects, but they can also have different layers of symbolism in there as well. So really interesting types of objects in museum collections.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I like to draw out that the interest that people might not necessarily first see in that collection.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk at the Petrie Museum, we talk a lot about ordinary objects and extraordinary stories. So pottery, this exemplifies that completely, I think. It's never usually what initially meets the eye. And that goes for pottery from all different types of cultures, different dates, different areas of the world. And it even goes for the mugs that you might have in your cupboard at home. I'm very fortunate to have my grandma's tea set from the 1970s, which is, in my cupboard at home in the kitchen. But it's alongside like mugs that I've maybe bought from museum shops or that I've been gifted, that I've got from a whole range of different places. And again, each of those vessels tells a story. And if someone looked in those kitchen cupboards today and didn't know anything about me, they could tell something of my personality. So the same goes for all of us, really. Beyond mugs, obviously, it could be plates or vases or, but yeah, pottery tells a story today as well as in the ancient world.
So yeah, it's quite clear these objects, reveal more information about the general history and the people. And it's so nice to look and get a glimpse of what people would have been using that for, whether it's food, drink or other means. Yeah,
exactly. And especially with ancient Egypt, this idea of the concept of ancient Egypt, certain things come to mind, such as, gold and glitz and glamour and particular types of, beautiful objects, traditionally beautiful objects, like maybe big statues or golden coffins or something like this. And these objects are important in their own way and interesting, but you're not going to really necessarily find a story about the real people of ancient Egypt from those objects. It's the more mundane, the more widespread objects, much like pottery, that were used on a day-to-day basis by people thousands of years ago, that are the objects that kind of hold those stories. So it's up to us as people who are interested in ancient Egypt, but also, people who are interested in museum collections and archaeology to sort of unlock those stories so that people can learn more about them.
Yeah, especially because historically Egyptology very much focused on tombs and temples that reflected only the highest echelons of society, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, you find out about the everyday person through these types of objects, which can really reveal so much more than necessarily, the Mask of Tutankhamun, for example.
Exactly. There's always a place in our lives for the Mask of Tutankhamun. It's a beautiful thing and very, very unique and special, of course. However, look beyond it. I really encourage you to look beyond the shiny, sparkly, beautiful, traditionally beautiful objects and look more closely at those objects of daily life because, sometimes I often think, in 1,000 years, how will what mark will we have, in the archaeological record for future archaeologists? And, a big part of that will be the objects that we use in our daily lives. So what can they tell people in the future about, elements of our identity? We can never know people, of course, we can never know them fully. When there's such a chronological gap between us and them, this is thousands of years, but we can start to think about how did they live, but also what links us to them in our kind of shared global human history, always trying to find the people behind the objects, which, is a big passion of mine.
So what's our next category of objects that people might see?
So, I mean, these are really in no particular order, other than to say pottery is probably the most popular. If you are looking at a museum collection, you might find jewellery, you might find beads and objects called amulets, which are kind of like lucky charms that people would have worn, you know, to protect them against certain ills of the world, but also to sort of gain the god or goddess's protection that was represented on those amulets. And that jewellery, you know, it could be a string of beads, it could be a ring or a bracelet. So quite recognizable objects to us. They could be made of different materials. So you might see, for example, a necklace made of beads of something like jasper or carnelian or really beautiful amethyst or other types of precious stones. You might also see clay beads. You might also see mud beads, so like unfired clay. You might see beads made out of a material called faience, which is it's a bit like glass. It's kind of a ceramic material that isn't clay, that's glazed with copper, so it turns blue. All these sorts of materials were used in ancient Egypt over many thousands of years to make jewellery, these items of kind of personal adornment. And we can look at them closely. So not only to, again, find those human connections. Maybe there's a necklace in your local museum that looks a bit like, I don't know, a necklace that your grandmother might have worn or that your sister wore for her wedding, or, you know, like family connection, a friend connection, that sort of connection that's so specific to your life, but actually isn't that different from someone who lived thousands of years ago. And we can also look at the materials that were made to make that jewellery and start to have a think about, was that person rich or poor? If you have precious stones, especially if you have gold, precious metals, those materials generally had to be imported to the Nile Valley, whether that's from outside Egypt, so from Sudan, for example, where a lot of the gold was acquired from, or the Eastern Desert, where certain precious stones would have been mined. A material like faience, this was more readily available to the population at different periods and was actually used in ancient mass production. So you could create jewellery using faience with moulds, for example, that could be made much more quickly. And that type of material might indicate someone of a lower socioeconomic status. But again, we don't know for sure. And then clay, mud, you know, it's generally available to the wider population. So that might be something that people with very little means had access to.
But it's so interesting to see how all of those object types are seen, and all in quite high numbers. So it shows that everyone in society wanted jewellery and wanted to have that, as you said, personal adornment. So it can be seen throughout that hierarchy, which is quite interesting.
Exactly. And also thinking about ancient fashion. So things don't change all that much. Fashion today is different to what it was 10 years ago, which was different to what it was 20 years ago. In ancient Egypt, it can be tempting to see, again, this like the block of ancient Egypt as one big thing. Whereas actually over thousands of years, fashions did come and go. And so that it can also tell us something about personal preferences when it came to what people wanted to wear, the sort of objects that they wanted to be buried with as well. And I think something, if you are in a museum and you're looking at necklaces or bracelets that have been restrung in modern times, that's something to be aware of as well, because what you're also looking at there on the whole is a design that's been put together for a necklace by museum curators and archaeologists, because the string that was used to hold the beads together in ancient times generally didn't survive because it was made of organic materials. What you're seeing in museums, if you see a string of beads, is, I like to call it a kind of imaginative reconstruction by, maybe the archaeologist, maybe by a museum curator, museum staff. It's not necessarily what the bead necklace looked like in ancient times. So, you know, the order of the beads might be different, but again, that's not a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of when you're looking at museum collections, kind of how many hands have played a role in shaping that object over the years.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think talking about museum collections really opens up that discussion that the history of the object isn't just ancient. There is also that modern aspect of, how many people have handled it? How has it been displayed? whether it's been conserved, and what work's been done on those objects since their discovery on an excavation, perhaps a few hundred years ago. But I think we'll be coming back to that a little bit more later.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent.
So let's move on to our next type of object.
Yeah, so something that, again, is quite recognisably ancient Egyptian type of object. These little figurines that you might have seen in a museum collection called shabtis. Now, they are made of different materials. So again, you might see them made out of this faience material, this non-clay ceramic glazed with copper to make it blue or green. You might see wooden shabtis, you might see stone shabtis, clay shabtis, so made of an awful lot of different materials, different sizes as well. The shabtis from the tomb of Tutankhamun, for example, were, I think, around 1 metre in height, give or take, whereas actually you might also find, very, very small shabtis, maybe as large as your little finger, that are also in museum collections today. So what is a shabti? So you might know the word shabti. You might have also seen or heard the word ushabti or shawwabti in ancient Egyptian context, in Egyptology books or on TV shows. And they all mean the same thing. Essentially, they are based on the ancient Egyptian word to answer. So the shabti is there to answer you when you call it. So in ancient Egypt, in the afterlife, when you died, you did not have a chance to relax. You had to do work. And we know that from designs on tomb walls, for example, that show the deceased kind of working in the fields, toiling away. Of course, after you die, you don't want to do any more work. You've already worked in your life. So you want someone or some people to do that work for you. And so the ancient Egyptian people believed that if you had these little figures in your tomb, in your grave, that they would come to life magically and do the work for you. And they have a very special inscription on the front of them, which is known as the shabti spell. So essentially what it says is the shabti saying, okay, I'm here. What do you need? I can do it. That's not a literal translation, but that's the essence. And the shabti was there to do your work for you. So there might be a shabti that's holding some tools, like a hoe and an adze that they might use in a field, that maybe they have a basket slung over their shoulder that the grain was going to be collected up in. And, these guys are hardworking. You had it in best case scenarios, you had a shabti for every day of the year. And then those shabtis were split into teams, and then there were overseer shabtis for those teams. So obviously not everybody had a shabti for every day of the year in their tomb, 365 shabtis plus. But if you did, that was the kind of best case scenario. And so sometimes you see graves where, there's just one or two shabtis. A lot of graves, especially of the poorer people, they didn't always have shabtis in there. So then I think it's quite interesting to think about the magic that the ancient Egyptians believed the shabtis kind of embodied, and thinking about if you don't have that shabti, is that magic still present somehow elsewhere to accompany you into the afterlife? And these are really important objects. They were made in huge numbers, as you can imagine. And we often, at the Petrie Museum, we often get, especially primary school teachers and parents and guardians of children, come in and say, oh my goodness, I need a shabti to help me with, my housework. Or the children that come in will say, I want a shabti to help me with my homework, or, something like that. So, yeah.
Or could we have them to answer our emails?
Oh, that's what I would want. Oh my goodness. I'd feel very cruel though. They're prepared for it. They've got their shabti spell. It's it comes with the territory, I guess, but I'd want to take good care of my shabti if I had one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is why you say we had 365 plus in some tombs. And that's why sometimes you see full walls or display cases. I'm picturing the one in the Petrie Museum that have tens, if not more, at a time, because these collections have had so many. And you have some beautiful examples, I'm thinking, from later in Egyptian history, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we have, so from the late period and even later, we have really beautiful, high quality examples of shabtis, some of which were hand carved. But generally speaking, so this is not a kind of golden rule, the detail in shabtis tends to decrease over time because of that mass production. So because of the use of molds to create faience shabtis, generally speaking, the quality decreases over time. So you get fewer in the kind of late period and moving into the Greco-Roman period, you get fewer unique hand-carved shabtis, whereas in the New Kingdom, you might see more of these. But that's a very, very general statement. But I think what's quite interesting is when you have, especially in a museum display, if you have lots of shabtis together in a display, you can see the development over time. And that's something that we do try to show at the Petrie Museum. It's something that you can see at Manchester Museum, who did it first, I should say, and in other museum collections, Liverpool World Museum as well. And it's also that method of display is something that Flinders Petrie was very keen on, that if you put lots of examples of an object type together in the same place, you can see the development over time. And that was really the essence of his kind of display methods for his first museum at UCL, which opened in 1915. So for our shabti display, we try to sort of weave some of that history into the display itself. And, you know, whenever you see a shabti in a museum, it could be the smallest collection, but they are present, and it's often as well.
I love shabtis. I think they're one of my favourite museum object types, I should say. And of course, I wrote the entry of our shabti in our book, Ancient Egypt in 50 Discoveries. So if you do want to find out a little bit more, I recommend picking up that book. Back to object. So yeah, let's move on to our next category.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the sorts of tools that you're going to find in a museum collection. So again, we all use tools in our daily lives today. So this is a type of object that we might be quite familiar with. So this could be anything from metal tools like copper chisels, for example, bronze axe heads that were used for various reasons in ancient Egypt. So metal chisels, for example, are very recognizable. So these can be of different thicknesses. They might have also have been attached to like a wooden handle as well. And these would have been used to carve stone, perhaps even carve some of the statues that you might be familiar with from museum collections. You might also find more, more basic tools, but still just as important, like hammerstones. So heavy hammerstones made of something like basalt that might have been used to hammer down softer stones. And I really like tool collections because, again, I mean, I'm always there for looking for the people behind the objects, but I also love to know how things were made in ancient Egypt. And I think if you look at the tools that were used to make objects, you can almost learn more about the objects themselves. And of course, in a lot of museum collections from different cultures, different areas of the world, but especially from Egypt, you also have stone tools. And stone tools were used during all periods. It's easy to think that stone tools stopped being used when metal tools came along, but it's not the case. Stone tools were still being used in the New Kingdom, for example, when metal tools were also widely available. And so you might find things like hand axes, you might find things like awls that were used to pierce leather, for example, sort of small points. You might find arrowheads, you might find stone axe heads, stone of different types, but especially flint and chert were used for creation of tools. And these could make very, very sharp tools that would have been, they would have been great things to have in your sort of on your tool belt. Not literally tool belt in ancient Egypt necessarily, but these are objects, especially with flint and chert, you could keep sharpening. So just like today, where you might sharpen your kitchen knives, the exact same thing happened in ancient Egypt and ancient Sudan. If your stone tool started getting a bit dull, or your metal tool, you would sharpen it on a whetstone, WHET. Which would help you make sure you would take care of your tools and make sure that they were still very sort of usable.
Yeah. You picked up on a really interesting point there about the manufacture of objects, how that can tell you more about the object. But I think it still in turn tells you more about the people because it's the decisions behind how that object is made as well. It's so interesting once you start digging further into these things and thinking about, what happened from even the thought of making that thing through to its final product.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea of that we will talk about a little more, but the object biography and, with tools, but all of the objects really that we're talking about today, they start with the craftsperson. And you're right that we don't know exactly how much independent decision making was in place in different periods. But I mean, ultimately, you're absolutely right. They represent the decisions, the methods developed by the craftspeople of ancient Egypt, which you often don't hear about in the official record.
No. Quite often the people doing the hard work are overlooked, let's say.
Yeah, not always recorded.
Yes.
Not always recorded. Yeah.
There's definitely work towards it in certain areas of Egyptology at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Don't forget to subscribe to Away with the Pharaohs, be intellectually stimulated by the discussions, and get involved by sending us your questions on social media. And check out our website, www.ees.ac.uk, to find out more about the Egypt Exploration Society, our history, current activities, and future ambitions.
Well, we've spoken about lots of different object types, and hopefully next time our listeners go to a museum or anywhere there's an Egyptian collection of objects, you'll be able to recognise some of these and understand them a little bit better. But museums are not just storage rooms. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes. So I would love, as curator, to get your knowledge about what that looks like.
Yeah, so again, thinking of that idea of object biography. So we've gone from the craftsperson creating an object to the ancient Egyptian person using an object, ancient Sudanese person using an object, to that object then maybe being buried or dropped and then, for thousands of years has been under the ground. It was then excavated. So that could have been by a team of archaeologists, that could have been by an individual. And then there are different sort of ways in which that object came to be in a museum, which we will touch on shortly. So let's say the object is already part of the museum collection. It's already a formal part of the museum collection. You're going to want to give that object a number because, well, for lots of reasons, but because in your collection you might have hundreds, maybe thousands of objects. We have over 80,000 objects in the Petrie Museum.
That's quite a number.
It's incredible. About 80,600. So you're going to want to recognize each object. Now, the politics of numbering objects is also very interesting because you're sort of museumifying an ancient cultural object. Even this morning, I had a class in the Petrie Museum who were asking me why it's okay to number objects. But ultimately, it's for a practical purpose because you do not want to mix up 80,600 objects and not know which one is which. There's an art to numbering an object. So maybe 100 plus years ago, an object number might have been written in a really conspicuous place on an object, simply so that it could be easily read. So that could be on the very front of a great big statue, which you sometimes see at the British Museum. We wouldn't do that nowadays. So when you're numbering an object, you're always going to want to try to find a place which preserves the aesthetic view of that object, so it doesn't disturb the look of the object when it's on display, but that is easy to find because you also don't want to be moving an object a lot to be able to find the number. So we physically number objects. We work very closely with a conservation team who are incredibly skilled and specially trained in lots of different types of materials and different object types. So you're going to want to be checking over your objects to make sure that, the condition of the object is good, but also for things like hazards. So in a museum collection, in particular those with more modern objects, so things like plastics, things like other types of photographic film that could be, degrade and be dangerous, it's really important to be aware of any hazards in the collection. Also very sharp objects, very, very heavy objects. So that's also something that, that we're aware of. And then there's display, of course. So in a museum, what tends to happen is that you have a permanent display of objects and a temporary, maybe exhibition space of objects. The Petrie Museum has a very, very large permanent display and a much smaller temporary display for lots of different reasons, mainly because it's such a tiny, tiny space. But in your temporary exhibition space, this might be somewhere where you display a new group of objects that tell a particular story around a particular theme. And in your permanent display, that will be themed ideally as well. So maybe, as we were talking about, you might have jewellery or you might have shabti heaven. But it's important to also put as much into permanent displays as we put into temporary displays as well.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work at the Petrie because there are so many objects. There's a lot in each case. And I've really enjoyed on recent visits seeing the highlights you've printed on the glass casings to literally like point out with an outline certain objects to tell a bit more of their story.
Yeah, so we call these our case interventions. So these are a sort of vinyl material which we create labels with and stick them on the outside of the cases, which honestly bring a bit of a colour pop to the displays as well, because anything you can do to try to hook a visitor's attention to look at an object. The Petrie Museum is very beige. We know and love the Petrie Museum, but there's not a huge amount of colour in all the displays. And so if you can just bring a bit of colour in there, it really sort of grabs visitors' attention. If you don't have a lot of space to be able to play around with new displays, this is a great way of doing it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear from yourself about this, because it's not just the object ends up in a museum and it stays there and that's it. It's constantly evolving. There's thought to it, and there's obviously these interventions to tell those stories or temporary exhibitions. So it's very interesting to see that side of museum work.
And ultimately, as Charlotte mentioned, museum collections, they're not static. They don't just, objects don't just get put in a case and then left there. One of my pet hates is when you read the newspaper and it says, a dusty old object in a museum, or a, forgotten document was discovered or something like this. Because yes, we make discoveries in museums every day. However, objects in museums are incredibly well cared for, and it's not like they're, covered in layers of dust before they're found. So that can be a bit tricky, like the language that's used in the media. That's just a pet hate. But we talk about excavating the collection. A very, very good friend, very wise colleague said to me when I got the job as curator of the Petrie Museum that I'll be excavating that collection for the rest of my career. He's not wrong. Yeah, so very, very dynamic work goes on in collections of all kinds.
I hope our listeners are excited for their next trip to see the work that's gone into that collection from curators, volunteers and other colleagues that are part of that story. So we've touched upon different objects and how they're treated once they're in the museum. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about how they got there. So how were objects distributed from Egypt or Sudan into places like the Petrie Museum?
It's a great question and a complex one. So how did objects come to be in museums? So if we're thinking about the 18th century and the early to mid 19th century, objects were removed from Egypt, usually under the auspices of the consuls, so the European consuls in Egypt. So, for example, the British consul Henry Salt, under whose sort of auspices there were lots of objects that are now in the British Museum were removed from Egypt, including by the very well-known Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who worked for Henry Salt to remove objects from Egypt. Moving into the 1880s, so from 1883, there was a formal process that was put into place in Egypt, which is known as partage. This essentially means division. So there was a process that was agreed upon whereby if you directed an excavation in Egypt, you shared half of the finds, you divided half the finds with the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and then you kept half the finds, you retained them. So whether that meant you could keep them for your own collection, whether you you ultimately gave them to your donors because there was no government funding for excavations. And so if you gave your donors objects every season, it kept them sweet, and it meant that they would continue to give you money for your excavation. You might also present them to museums. So this partage process, which was formally applied for 1883, was essentially devised by Flinders Petrie and Gaston Maspero, who was the French head of the Antiquities Service at the time. And so what we need to think about, what we talk about there in the Petrie Museum with regards to the partage process, is legal versus ethical, or licit and illicit versus ethical. So if we think about what was legal, it was legal to remove objects from Egypt during this period of partage, but it was not ethical because the people that were making the laws, making the decisions, were generally French and British. They weren't Egyptian. And so looking for the Egyptian agency behind partage and behind that process, is ultimately not present. So the partage system was in place right up until 1983. So it was in place for a century. And of course, the Egypt Exploration Society benefited greatly from the partage process.
Yes, as you say, objects were given to donors and museums. So yes, the EES has a history of that. And I will mention the Artefacts of Excavation website, which has all of our distribution lists. So you can trace where the objects came from Egypt and where they ended up in museums or collections around the world. So yeah, very interesting history of Egyptology research avenue there.
Yeah, so on that point of object distribution, Flinders Petrie distributed objects from his excavations in Egypt all around the world. So if you go, as far as Japan, you can go to Kyoto and see objects from Petrie's excavations in Egypt. You can go to America, Australia, Ghana. You can go to museums all around the UK. Oh, goodness me, mainland Europe. Pretty much every major collection, and those that wouldn't be classed as a major collection of Egyptian objects, have links to Flinders Petrie's excavations. It wasn't just Petrie. Again, John Garstang, who was based in the University of Liverpool, operated on that same system. So that idea of objects being distributed right across the globe still has impacts today on the work that we do as Egyptologists, as museum professionals and researchers. One area of distribution that, I still can't quite get my head around is why on earth he did it, but Flinders Petrie broke up tomb groups and then sent different objects from those tomb groups all around the world. And it was for different reasons. Maybe he decided that certain of those objects was more relevant to be kept for the Petrie Museum. Maybe he saw a perceived gap in a collection somewhere in the world and then decided to send those objects. Of course, the other museums around the world were also able to choose objects that they wanted or object types. So that also led to the sort of breaking up of tomb groups. But as you mentioned, Charlotte, it's the archival documentation that's kept in places like the Petrie Museum, the EES, also the Griffith Institute at the University of Oxford. This important archival documentation that details, so not only the nature of the excavations, but where objects were distributed to. Sometimes it's clearer to distinguish which object was distributed than others. So, for example, you might have, a named shabti that's quite easy to track. But you might also have group of pots, much less straightforward to identify. But these incredibly important documents, which, as you say, are available online through the Artefacts of Excavation website, they act as the key for us to be able to unlock this really complex history of object distribution, which honestly can often mean that people all around the world become captivated with ancient Egypt because they're able to see their museum collection locally, which might have objects from Petrie's excavations or from elsewhere. And that's what gets them into ancient Egypt and Egyptology. And it's also important to bear in mind that museum collections, including the Petrie Museum, have an awful lot of objects which were also bought in Egypt on the open market. So again, late 19th, early 20th centuries, it was legal to do so. Still frowned upon by some folk even then, but not ethical. So we are, as well as other collections, we're also unpicking those histories of the objects that were purchased by Petrie and others in Egypt, which made their way into museum collections.
Yes, there's a very interesting article by Dan Potter that looks at some of that work in the Autumn 2025 magazine. So highly recommend a read if you're interested in these stories about how objects ended up where they are today. But yeah, and you touched on, obviously, archives. They're so important. And we have so many researchers who come into this building, this room, in fact, to look at the archive and try and trace those objects. And people have been able to do that and reunite them digitally, which has been such a joy to be able to see. Like you said, the media, some of the wording is not what we would choose, I suppose.
We wouldn't always agree with.
But that idea of the discoveries that can be made in museums and archives, or uncovering these stories, whether they're about objects or the people, it can be so fascinating to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're finding out more all the time.
Well, we've spoken about a lot today, but bringing us back to that question on a final note, are Egyptian artefacts in museums priceless treasures or just pieces of an ancient puzzle? I think it's both and so much more.
Yeah, exactly. I would hard argue that it's both. Priceless treasures don't have to be made of gold. Every object from ancient Egypt arguably is unique and therefore priceless because it can't be replaced. But they are also pieces of an ancient puzzle, which we are continuing to put together as a global kind of Egyptology community to be able to learn more, again, about the people behind those objects, the people that lived in ancient Egypt and Sudan thousands of years ago. But again, bringing that right up to the modern day, like in the context of modern Egypt, modern Sudan.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me. And I hope our listeners are excited for their next trip to a museum to have a look at those objects, maybe in a new light.
Yeah, and please do share your own stories of your visits to your museum collections, or maybe you're able to go to the Petrie Museum. And, the EES would love to hear about them.
We would. Yes, please do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So I think that all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you, Anna, for joining me today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for listening today.